back, friends, to Build a Lot Acres. My name's Case, and in today's episode, we're going to be discussing two-wheel drive tractors and are they any good? Stay tuned. So you might be asking yourself, Case, what is your experience with these tractors? Do you know what you're talking about? Let me say this. I've owned two-wheel drive tractors. This Ford 1700 you see behind me, which is a compact diesel tractor. I also own multiple two-wheel drive garden tractors. I've owned them for the last 15 years or so. Even before that, my father had tractors that I would use. So I've been around tractors my whole life. And I want to tell you right now that they can be used around your property. You can use them for snow removal. You can use them for grading. You can use them for york raking, logging, pulling trailers with firewood, etc., etc. So there's a lot of uses for these two-wheel drive tractors, and there are benefits. So let's see what they are. So we got the Coyote out of here so we can really focus on the topic at hand. Two-wheel drive tractors. What are some of the benefits? I think the biggest benefit is got to be the price. You can pick up a used two-wheel drive tractor way cheaper than you're going to get a comparable four-wheel drive tractor. Now, let's take loaders, buckets out of the equation. Let's compare a tractor like this to a four-wheel drive 1700 Ford, which they had, without a bucket, just a 3-point hitch PTO. You're going to find this model two-wheel drive 2 to 3 times cheaper than a comparable four-wheel drive, even though the tractor's over 40 years old at this point. I paid $1,800 for this, and I think it was in 2018, whereas a four-wheel drive 1700 Ford here in 2022, you're going to pay at least $5,000 even without a bucket. So you're talking 2.5 times the price for the four-wheel drive. And that four-wheel drive may be necessary for some jobs, but it may not be for a lot of other jobs. So let's discuss those. Unless you're working in a lot of really wet, muddy areas or in hills, four-wheel drive isn't always necessary. Whether it be plowing snow, whether it be york raking, rototilling, logging, all those kind of different things, the two-wheel drive tractors can do a ton of work. I would say if you're going to be planning on doing a lot of bucket work, yes, four-wheel drive definitely helps. Or if you're going to be, like I said, working in a lot of really steep areas or wet, muddy areas, yeah, four-wheel drive is definitely a benefit. But like my property here is mostly flat and it's fairly dry. I did all my work with two-wheel drive tractors, no buckets, for a number of years. Well, like I said, the price is the biggest benefit. You're going to get it way, way cheaper. So if you're on a budget and you still need to do work, you still want a tractor, etc., I would definitely look into two-wheel drive tractors. Another big benefit is going to be they're simpler. There's not as many parts to break. There's a less, simpler design as far as the front axle is concerned. And they're just overall less moving parts to break at the end of the day. So another big advantage to the two-wheel drive tractor is going to be the front tire aggressiveness. A lot of four-wheel drive tractors obviously are going to have aggressive tires front and rear, whether that be an ag tire or R4 skid steer type tire. The two-wheel drive tractors are typically, because the front tires are only for steering, they're not driving anything like the back tires are. Front tires on two-wheel drive are typically going to be smooth, so when you turn on a grass or something like that, you have a much less chance of damaging your turf than you do with a four-wheel drive tractor. I've owned the Coyote and the Ford here about the same amount of time, and I can tell you from first-hand experience driving across my lawn, which was pretty flat and dry, the Coyote does a lot more damage in the lawn than the Ford does. That could partly be contributed to the weight difference, but I can tell you right now, even in two-wheel drive in the Coyote, it still damages more because the tires are more aggressive. So if you're going to be doing a lot of work around your yard, landscaping, mowing, that kind of thing, two-wheel drive tractors, in my opinion, are the better choice. Unless you're mowing on really steep ground, then you might argue other ways, but for most properties, the majority, I would say two-wheel drive mowers are going to be where you want to be. So just to add on to the front tire thing a little bit more, going back to price, when you need to replace a front tire, say you ran over a nail or a sharp thorn, something popped your tire, it's a lot cheaper to replace one of these tires than it is the Coyote four-wheel drive front tire. I mean, you're talking significantly cheaper because the tires tend to be a lot smaller, they're not as many plies, and they're just overall less expensive and easier to change out and work on if you need to do so. Another big advantage is no one wants them. So you can find two-wheel drive tractors a lot easier used in decent condition than four-wheel drive. Everyone sees that four-wheel drive and it's like a magnet, whereas a two-wheel drive, people will just look past them and walk the other way. So you'll probably have a much higher chance of finding a decent two-wheel drive tractor used than four-wheel drive. Four-wheel drive tractors, I don't want to say they tend to get beat up more, but people tend to use them harder and try to do more with them, in my opinion at least, than they do two-wheel drive. So if we go back in history, let's say back to the 1940s, 50s, 60s, most tractors that were operating were bigger farm tractors. These size tractors really weren't very common. Most of your tractors are going to be much bigger because the farms back then were much bigger, hundreds of acres. They needed really big tractors to do chores. And most of those tractors were two-wheel drive. Despite being two-wheel drive, they still got the job done. They plowed the fields. They did what they needed to do to grow their food and make the farms work. It wasn't really until, I would say, the subcompact, I don't want to say invasion, but it wasn't really until the subcompacts from Japan started coming out, and I would say like the late 70s, 80s, early 80s, is when you really started seeing four-wheel drive become much more common. The reason they needed four-wheel drive over in Japan is because they had a lot of really wet areas like rice paddies, and they needed the four-wheel drive to physically do the work. And they also needed small tractors because they didn't have big plots of land like we do here in the US. So they needed a small tractor that was also very capable, meaning four-wheel drive, getting in wet areas. So they started bringing those over to the US, and they became much more common and popular. Nowadays, here we are 45, whatever years later, and it seems like all you see is four-wheel drive, but there's a lot of benefits to two-wheel drive. Well, I want to say thank you for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Maybe it gave you some food for thought on whether or not a two-wheel drive tractor might be right for you. See you next time.